we're talking about Rechitza on Yom Kippurim. And first the Gemara brings this Braita that says simply that if you go to greet your father or your Rebbe, or to greet someone who is greater than you, we understand that to be someone who is more learned than you, someone greater than you in learning, on Yom HaKippurim, then you can pass through water up to your neck and it won't be a problem. So we have this idea that this is another exception to washing on Yom Kippurim. So this is not really washing. It doesn't fit the criteria for washing on Yom Kippur. Why doesn't it fit criteria for washing on Yom Kippur?
There's no pleasure.
We're not doing it well. We're not doing it.
You're not doing it for pleasure. You're not doing it for the purpose of pleasure. There may be pleasure, but that's not the inyan.
Right. So there's this idea that since you're not doing it for the purpose of pleasure, it's not considered a chitza, but from this Braita, what else might we conclude is a limiting factor in terms of going in the water on Yom Kippur?
That you can do it for the sake of giving kavod to somebody who is higher or more learned than you are.
Right, and not for what?
Not for somebody who is not higher and more learned than you are. Somebody's either your equal or your lesser.
Right, very good. Someone who's your equal or lesser than you in kavod, presumably it wouldn't be permitted. So then Gemara goes and asks about what about the Rav going to the Talmud? So based on what Michael Warner just said a moment ago, if the Gemara hadn't asked this question, what might we think, or if the Gemara, without the Gemara's question here, right? What would we think the answer to this question is? That is, what would we think the din of a Rav going to his Talmud is on Yom Kippur?
In a word, no.
In a word, no, because presumably the kavod of the Talmud is not as great as the Rav. So why does the Gemara ask the question? What's the basis for the question altogether?
So in fact, it may be that there's some other basis for making the visit, such as an intimate connection, such as Talmud Torah.
Okay, so you mentioned this intimate connection last week. What exactly do you mean by that, and why would you think? Where would you get that idea from?
Well, in the previous, it said in the Baraita that you could cross a body of water in order to visit your father, who may not be more learned than you are. He may be greater than you in other forms of kavod, but he may not be greater than you in learning. And so that would suggest that maybe there's some other purpose besides Talmud Torah.
Okay, so answer my other question first. What you use this term intimate connection, which we don't see anywhere in the Gemara. What do you think that means? Why do you use that term? What does that mean to you? In plain language, what does it mean?
Like an important friendship or important family connection. Maybe, yeah. or yeah, but I'd say it's like a family or quasi-family connection, which I think connection between a teacher and a student could be, because you do say, one does say kaddish for one's teacher.
Right. Okay. So as I pointed out last time, we know from elsewhere that in terms of showing respect, that if you have to choose between your Rebbe, we'll use the term Rebbe to mean your Rav Muvak, the Rav from whom you learned most of your Torah. If you have to choose between your Rebbe and your father in terms of showing respect, then you have to show respect to your Rebbe first, assuming that you didn't learn Torah from your father. So the reason I'm nodding my head, this idea of intimate connection, I think maybe you might be drawing a little bit too much from this, because the question here is, when we talk about the father, you want to conceptualize that to say father equals intimate connection. So that could intimate connection, like having a close relationship, that could be with anybody, any arbitrary person that you happen to know. You might have a close relationship with them.
So maybe instead of using the word intimate connection, I'd say family, primary family relationship, or quasi-family relationship.
Okay, and then again, I would say that you're trying to extrapolate more than what the Breita says, in the sense that what you want to say is that the father is just a stand-in for any close family relationship. But do we know that to be true? No. So I think for the moment, at least, it's safe to say that the idea that you're allowed to pass through water in Yom Kippur for someone to whom you are close doesn't really follow from the Breita. I think you're trying to squeeze a little more out of the Breita than the Breita actually says. So let's take the Breita kifshuto, and it's really the other. It seems to be the other thing. So the kind of kavod that we're talking about here is kvod haTorah. So you can go. There's two kinds of kavod here, I should say. So the kavod of your father. So that's a kavod that is due to your father midioraita, regardless of whether you've learned Torah, right? The Torah says kaberet avicha v'yatim, right? Kaberet avicha v'yatimecha. So if I were to extrapolate, I might say this extends to the mother, because I'm also due to give kavod to the mother. But I'm not due to give kavod to people to whom I am close just because I'm close to them. There's a special mitzvah in the Torah that tells me that I have to give kavod to my father, and I have to give kavod to my mother, but I don't, for example, have to give kavod on that level to even other members of my family. There is a kind of pecking order without going into Hilchot Kibud Av V'Em, but midioraita, really, it's specifically your mother and your father. And so let's say that if you go to greet your father, if one goes to greet their father on Yom Kippur, regardless of the father's status in Torah, you would be permitted to go through water up to your neck, and similarly for your Rebbe, or even somebody who's greater than you, and as we said, greater than you in Torah. So the dispensation for the Rebbe and for Misha Gadol Mimenu, that's Kvod HaTorah. That's the kavod that's due to people that are greater than you because of their status in Torah, because they are representatives of the Torah. So, just to clarify, then the other question we would have here would be why does the Breita give us this shiur, right? It gives us this measure. You can go up to your neck. So why specifically up to your neck? So
I was just thinking the same thing. Can
Yeah.
you hear me? I was
Yeah,
thinking the same thing.
That's what
Because maybe above your neck it's dangerous.
maybe because above your neck it's dangerous. So if that's true, so then it's saying, you can go as long as you're not going to put yourself in danger.
I was going to suggest something different,
Okay, go ahead.
which is that if you get your hair wet, you might end up doing melacha inadvertently by wringing out your hair.
Well, if that would be the case, so then what other problem would you have?
Actually, no, that doesn't sound works.
No. Just say, so if that's true, though, what other problem would I have to be worried about that the Breita doesn't address?
Well, clothing, other
Clothing,
items.
right? I don't have to go up to my neck to get my clothes wet, right? Presumably I'm wearing something. And so my clothes are getting wet. And so there are two potential problems with getting my clothes wet. What are the two potential problems?
There's kabisa, which I'm guessing is
Right. So in other words, one is laundering. So in other words, when you get your clothes wet, maybe that's like cleaning your clothes. And what's the other one?
wringing out your clothes.
Wringing out your clothes, which could either be a tolda of kvisa, or else it's a tolda of it's mefarek. I can't think straight right now.
Extraction, whatever that is in Ivrit, no?
What did you say?
I know. It's extraction, like extracting.
Yeah,
one thing.
extraction. Yeah.
I can't remember the term in Ivrit.
Right. So these are issues. So the idea that your hair is going to get wet, that doesn't seem to be the limiting factor. But so at this moment we might think that so here we don't the Breita doesn't give us that information, but we're going to get, we will extract it, as it were, from the Gemara that we're going to look at now. So I think we started to look at this last time. So what's the din of the Rav going to the Talmid? So a moment ago we just said, on the face of it, I should know the answer to this because based on the Breita, it would not appear to be permitted for the Rav to go to the Talmid. But before we go on, what might be the reason that it would be permitted for the Rav to go to the Talmid? In other words, the reason.
Talmud Torah.
So be more specific. What do you mean?
Teaching and learning Torah.
So
the teacher could be going to students in order to teach. So in the Breita, what was the reason that one could go in front of go to greet the Rav on Yom Kippur? So it would seem on the face of it initially that it would be for the sake of a vote, but in fact it could be in order to learn from one's Rebbe.
Well, on the face of it, let's just say, in other words, that's the reason the Breita gives, the reason you can go, or it's the reason that's immediately alluded to. You go because because there's an imperative to give kavod to one's Rebbe, regardless of whether they're going to teach you something at this moment or not. But there isn't an imperative for the Rebbe to show kavod to the student per se. But as you say, maybe the reason might be that the Rebbe will go to be teaching Torah. In that case, maybe that would be permitted. So Tashma Dama Rav Yitzchak bar Chana Anachazite Lazire Dazal Gabe Rav Chia bar Ashi Talmidei. So Rav Yitzchak bar Chana says, I saw Zire that went to his student Rav Chia bar Ashi. So let's just fill this out. So what are the parts that are implied? What are the details that are implied but not said? The simplest thing. What's our question, and how does this answer the question?
So the question would be, how does this address the question of a teacher going to visit the students? And so it would answer the question if in fact.
Actually, stop. Ask your question better. What are the details of your question? This sounds like a schlep, but I want you to give me all the details of the question.
So does this?
Harav Eitzel Talmid Mai. What's the question?
Can a teacher go visit a student?
Yeah, but what's the question? That's not my question. In other words, this is shorthand for the question.
And the larger question is, can one go visit can one cross a river in order to teach?
You're almost there.
In order to teach can a Rebbe go cross a river in order to teach a student?
You're almost there.
I'm still swimming. I'm up to my neck.
Michael Schwartz, did you want to say?
No, I was just going to add up to one's neck in water and on Yom Kippur.
And on Yom Kippur. Okay, like I said, this is excuse me. It seems like a schlep, but when you're learning, especially when you're learning Mishnah, when you're learning Gemara, but especially Mishnah and so forth, which is communicating to us in a shorthand, even though this is our topic, let's be careful and let's always try to flesh everything out. It's very important, as we go through, in order to keep things straight, have to always add these things in. So the Gemara writes in shorthand. We don't have to speak in shorthand. That's the oral part of the transmission that we are supplying. So the question is, what is the din on Yom Kippur for a Rebbe to go and visit his student if the Rebbe would have to pass through water? And then that would be the question. And then just to clarify, because it is forbidden to wash on Yom Kippur, and what we understand until now is that even when one comes into contact with water on Yom Kippur, not for the sake of washing, we already understand that there are limitations. We already understand that there's this idea, we're starting off with the idea that you shouldn't essentially come into contact with water on Yom Kippur for the sake of pleasure. But what we understand based on the Gemara until now, we have these limiting factors that tell me even if your intent is not for pleasure, we limit that contact. Even, right, so we have very specific ways of very specific categories that we limit it to. So we want to know, now that we've said what we've said, and we've said that one may pass through water on Yom Kippur to go and greet their father or their Rebbe. Now we want to know, is that going to be, is that dafka? In other words, is it only for those categories of people, for the Rebbe and the father, or does it work the other way around? And maybe it might work the other way around. That is, that the Rebbe can go visit the student, in other words, can go greet the student, because maybe what's implied is that they're going to be teaching. Or maybe not. In other words, the Gemara here doesn't say yet, but let's go see. So now, Rav Yitzchak bar Chana attests to a case where he said, I saw Zihiri, who was the Rebbe, who went to Rav Chia bar Ashi, his student. So, under what circumstances did Zihiri go to see Rav Chia bar Ashi, his student?
So presumably it involved crossing water up to maybe up to his neck, and it was Yom Kippur.
Very good, right? In other words, I know that because that was, I want to answer my question, and I defined the question in that way, that can the Rebbe go to the student on Yom Kippur, going through water, maybe even up to his neck? And so when I have this story of Zihiri and Rav Chia bar Ashi, I have to assume that that's the point. That's the point of the story, is that here I have Maseh Shahaya, and this is what happened. And they went, Zihiri went, and he went through water up to his neck on Yom Kippur. So Rav Ashi says, how Rav Chia bar Ashi, hu da azal gabe de Zihiri Rabbe. So he says that case, that was Rav Chia bar Ashi, who went to his Rebbe Zihiri. So what is Rav Ashi saying? What's his point?
That you can't use that as a proof. It wasn't the student going to it wasn't the Rebbe going to the student. It was the opposite, which we already learned from the Braita.
Very good. Right, it's the opposite of what you want to say, Rav Yitzchak bar Chana. It was the student, Rav Chia bar Ashi, who went to his Rebbe Zihiri on Yom Kippur through water, and we already know that that's sanctioned based on the Braita that we just learned. So now we go on. Rava Shar Livnei Ever Yamina, the Ma'avar B'Maya Linture Pire. So now we go into a different. So we have now a different case. Rava gave permission to those who lived on the right side to pass through water to guard fruit. So I remember we did do this part last week. So what does all this mean? Who are the B'nai Aver? What is the Aver Yamina? And what's the Chidush here? What's the Aver Yamina?
The right bank of a body of water.
And what did we say? What is the right bank? Because that would seem to be a relative.
So that wait a second, that would be for facing. That would be the north side.
Why do you
No.
say the north side?
Well, because we assume we're oriented to the. Oh no, it would be the same perspective. Second, we're facing. No, it'd be the I can't remember. We assume that east is forward. Nachon.
Michael Schwartz, do you know from last week? What did we say?
It was the south side because of the way you faced in the Beit HaMikdash, you're looking east.
Right. So this is what we said last week. So that Stam Ever Yamina, I might assume is going to be the south side, because in Tanakh, when we describe the Beit HaMikdash, we understand that the Tzad Yamin is the south side. And the reason it's the south side is because we view the Beit HaMikdash as not only being oriented from west to east, but actually is pointing from west to east. That is, that the Beit HaMikdash is looking out toward the east. And so if the Beit HaMikdash is looking out toward the east, so the front of it, the front of the Beit HaMikdash then would be the north, would be, is the east side. Each side is going to be the right and the left. So the south side is going to be the right side. And the left side would be the north side. Okay, the truth is it's not vital for this, for the understanding of this passage, but just an interesting thing to keep in mind. So Rava allowed people who lived on the south bank of an unnamed river that we're talking about to go through water to guard fruit. To go through water when?
On Yom Kippur.
On Yom Kippur, right. So on Yom Kippur, they're allowed to go through water to go to guard fruit. So a couple of things. First of all, what happened to the case of the Rav going to visit the student on Yom Kippur? What would we conclude based on what we learned so far? Is that permitted or not permitted?
We would conclude that it's not proven that it's permitted. We don't have a proof that it is permitted.
Okay, so A, we don't have a proof that it's permitted, and then B, what would be a reason for me to say it's not permitted?
It would seem to be that the standard is kavod.
Say a whole. Give me a whole answer.
It would seem that it would. Our proofs so far, our evidence so far, would seem only to support that that is permitted. It would seem to say that it's permitted to cross a body of water up to one's neck on Yom Kippur, only in order to give kavod to one's teacher or one's father.
Very good, right? So this is right. So this is how we started off this section, the Gemara, that based on the Braita, I would have thought that this question of Rav Eitzel Talmid is already implied. It's already implied from the Braita that would not be permitted. It would seem that it's not permitted because the Rav doesn't have an imperative to go and show kavod to his student. The Gemara wanted to bring proof that nonetheless it's permitted because we had Maaseh Rav. We had an actual case of a Rebbe going to visit his student, but then that's rejected by Rav Ashi. He says, no, we don't actually, that the case that you bring doesn't support it because the case was the other way around. So at this moment, I don't have any support at all for the idea that a Rebbe would be allowed to go visit his student on Yom Kippur by passing through water. So that brings us now to Rava. So Rava, what's the chidush of Rava? What is he telling me that I didn't know until now?
He is permitting people to cross a river for a reason on Yom Kippur, for a reason that would seem to have nothing to do with giving kavod to one's rebbe or teacher.
And so first of all, he's giving me a case where one can go through water on Yom Kippur, even for not reasons of giving kavod, but for what reason?
Presumably, I mean, seems preventing a financial loss.
Yeah, okay, so to guard property, which by extension, why would one guard property? Would be to prevent financial loss. Amare Abai Rava. So okay, so now we have yet another exception to passing through water on Yom Kippur. So one can go through water, right? So one can wash for different reasons. Excuse me. We've extended the idea of washing to just coming in contact with water altogether. So one isn't allowed to really come into contact with water, for the sake of washing for pleasure, but one is allowed to come into contact with water even for the specific purpose of washing, in order to remove dirt, in order to feed a child. These are exceptions to that rule. And now we're dealing with this, with sort of the next level, which is that you come into contact with water when you have no particular intention of coming into contact with water, but it's inevitable, right? So in order to accomplish your goal, it's inevitable. So as I mentioned last time, it's really a kind of davar she'eino mitkaven. It would fall into a category of doing something that you don't intend to do, but it's part of the process to get to the goal of what you do intend to do. Your intention is, let's say, to go visit your Rebbe, and the part that's not intended is to go through water, to come into contact with water. So you're allowed to come into contact with water because you have a higher purpose, or you have a particular purpose which is permitted on Yom Kippur and maybe even encouraged. So when I talk about like bil Pnei Aviv, Pnei Rabo, Pnei Misha Gadol Mimenu, so I might say that because there's an imperative to give kavod. There's a positive reason that would tell me that I should do this. Now we come to Rava, and Rava says, even if there isn't that kind of imperative of giving kavod, but there's another reason that I could allow you, or that you would be allowed to do this, and that would be to guard your property. Apparently, as Michael says, in order to avoid financial loss. So Abai says to Rava Tanya de Messiah, there's a braita that supports you. Shomrei perot ovrin ad savaran b'mayim ve'ein chosheshin. There's a braita that says pretty much exactly what you say, that people who guard fruits pass through their neck in water and are not concerned. So, once again, to schlep this out, right? So, what would be the full reading of this little braita?
It doesn't say that it's on Yom Kippur.
No, but Beseder. So first of all, B'Shomrei Perot B'Yom Kippur. It doesn't say, but how do I know that it's referring to Yom Kippur?
Because that's the context.
That's our context. And if I were to take it out of our context, then it would seem to be superfluous. Like, why wouldn't one be allowed to go through water? So it must be a context where you might otherwise think that it's not permitted. And that would be Yom Kippur. So when Abaye brings us as a proof, it's understood this is the context. And again, it's just another example of how a Braita, as part of an oral tradition, is trying to reduce the number of words that you would have to memorize. But you'll understand what it means because of its context. Rav Yosef. Okay, so just to emphasize this point, so this idea, though, we understand now. This idea is really a chidush, right? It's telling me something that I really might not have expected, because to pass through water, right? So the whole idea of passing through water, right? To walk through water on Yom Kippur, for any reason at all, is already a big chidush, because you're going to get wet, right? And we have, we haven't figured out yet a way to walk through water and not get wet. So doing that on Yom Kippur, I already understand from the previous part of the sugya, should be forbidden mishum mechitza, even if it's not your intention. That there are only very specific cases that I'm allowed to come into contact with water, and here I'm letting you basically get your entire body wet on Yom Kippur. So when it's for kavod av or kavod haTorah, so I'll say that's a kind of compelling interest. Kavod aviv and kavod rabo, there's a kind of compelling interest with can't think of a word, but in other words, for a higher purpose. And I wouldn't necessarily deduce from that you would be allowed to go for any other purpose besides kavod rav or kavod av. But now I understand that even not for inyanei kavod, even not to show respect, but in order to guard your property, you would be allowed to go. So why would that be permitted? We have a concept in the Torah that Chasad Torah al Mamonam Shel Yisrael. The Torah was concerned about the money, the finances of Jews. Torah didn't want us to lose money, and it comes out in different ways. And I'm assuming that that's the underlying principle here.
So, I mean, it seems that when the term perot is used in the context of Mishnah or Gemara, it would be as often as not metaphorical as physical foods. As in, Elu deferim shadam ohel perotechem ba'olam hazeh v'hakeren.
So what are you trying to say? What do you think perot means here?
So it could be physical fruits, or it could be revenues.
Yeah. In other words, I'm glad that you mentioned this, right? So perot is a stand-in for, that's why I blithely used the word property. The idea is, right, so perot, as you say, like from the Mishnah in Peah, I understand perot, and also from elsewhere. Perot is used throughout the Mishnah to refer to profits. It's a stand-in for the word profits. So in this context, it seems to be referring to a specific kind of property, payre. How do we understand? So how do we understand that? What would you be doing exactly to be shomer perot? Let's say in the most literal sense, what do you understand this to mean?
Well, I mean, the most literal physical sense, this would be okay, making sure that you don't lose your fruit, like no human being or animal takes your fruit. Right. Make sure that that no person or no animal takes your fruit.
Right. So in other words, on that level, so yeah, it would be like, you'd be there to make sure that your fruit isn't stolen or consumed by an unwanted consumer like an animal.
But but it would also suggest that you're able to go to cross in order to prevent a loss of profits or loss of revenues, but you're not necessarily able to cross to prevent loss of sort of capital, capital assets.
Yeah, so if we take pay rate to mean, like you say, it means revenue of some sort, so maybe that's a limiting factor. But then I would,
Actually, although I can also say you call the homer if you're able to go to protect your transient loss of transient revenues, then in the call the homer you'd be able to go to protect your capital assets.
well, I'm not sure if it's a kal v'chomer, but in other words, I would just say that it seems to me, and this is why I said property. I think it's just a stand-in for property that I think it would be for, and the point is that, in other words, you're going to prevent some kind of financial loss. So it's not mishum kavod. It's not, and it's not what were other reasons that you were allowed to wash on Yom Kippur?
Feeding a child, feeding a baby.
Right. So wait, I'm sorry, say it again. Feeding a child, right? So that was an issue of washing mishum sakana. So it's not mishum sakana. And what's the other reason you're allowed to wash on Yom Kippur?
On waking up, upon waking up.
Yeah, so that seems to be implied, right? That you mishum ruach ra'ah, which is really sakana. And what's the other reason?
If you're really dirty,
If you're dirty, you're allowed to wash if you're dirty. So this isn't any of those things. So this is the chidush, right? So we had these exceptions that you're allowed to wash if you're dirty. You're allowed to wash mishum sakana. You're allowed to go through water. That is, so you're allowed it falling into this category of rechitza broadly, right? To show kavod. And now we say, and then there's another exception. The other exception is that you're allowed to go to guard your property.
Sure.
Yes.
This shows that these people were working people, they were farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So that the standard, the average person, the average Jew was going to be a farmer. There might be some people who were artisans, and there might be some other, kinds of middle professions, but yes, the vast majority of people were going to be farmers. A very small number of people are going to be teachers and students. That's a very small number of people. But yeah, it's worth pointing out. Michael Werner, did you want to say something?
Only then for also understanding and metaphorically, and this could also apply to merchants, artisans.
Yeah, right. So without trying to squeeze too much about Babylonian society in the 4th century, but we know from here and we know from other places, and that most people were farmers, and there would be a small class of artisans or merchants, and there would also be a very small class of people who learned like full time. We know from the Gemara that twice a year we had Yachei Kala, where at the end of the growing seasons, the 2 growing seasons, when the farmers would have like a break, then the minhag was for them to go to the yeshivas to sit and learn for a few weeks. So that was most of the people, right? Most of the people who were farmers would do that. And even if they weren't great learners, like the Gemara says, even if they came there and fell asleep, they would still get schar halicha. They'd still get the sachar for coming, even if they didn't end up learning very much. But yes, it's a good point. So, Paul, now that you raised it, I think you're correct. So what's the point of mentioning that? Why is that? Why do you think that's relevant?
No, because there are now people nowadays who think they can learn Gemara without working.
Okay, so that actually I wouldn't necessarily derive that from here, but okay, point taken. I think the point is what I'm trying to bring out is that what's interesting is that here you see that Chazal were concerned about the livelihood of average people. They were concerned about the, and that's what I mean. Chasad Torah Mamonam Yisrael is a real principle that's learned from the Torah, and here we put it in practice because until now I have these exceptions to the rule of rechitza, but I might think that okay, but an average person to go and make sure that his apple crop is is going to be there for his harvest the next day. Maybe that's not so important. Maybe it's better to say for him to be more circumspect on Yom Kippur and not get wet at all. But we see, no, this is also this is a valid and even important reason that Chazal would have let somebody get wet on Yom Kippur.
I'm wondering if we can actually read this in light of, I can't remember if it's Mishnah, in the light of the passage from Peah. Because there are two examples so far. Kuvud of M and Talmud Torah would, actually are included in the list. And would this maybe, in fact, be addressing the other items on the list?
Okay, so maybe. I don't think it's important right now to make that relationship. You are welcome to. I mean, it's interesting what you're saying, but we'll just take it as it is for now. Rav Yosef Shara Lahu Livnei Beit Tarbu L'Me'avar B'Maya L'Meitei L'Firka L'Meizal Lo Shara Lahu. Okay, so now we come to yet another.
Sheila, I want to say something else. It's interesting to notice that the Jews in Babylon, they were farmers, not like later on during the Middle Ages, Jews were no more farmers because they wanted to be able to move to some other place, but they were there. They were living really close to their property, and at that time,
yeah, okay, but there's another reason why Jews weren't necessarily farmers in later in Europe, because they weren't always allowed to hold land, right? That was the problem. To take what you're saying, so there's an implication here that Jews owned land in Bavel, presumably they owned land. Because if they were only there as arisim, people who essentially were kind of renting land, then they may or may not have an interest in guarding the fruit.
Well, no, maybe because if they have usufructuary rights, then in fact the fruit would be
It depends on their contract, and I'm not going to get into it. It depends on the contract. There are two basic ways of making a contract for renting fruit. One is that you give a percentage of your crop. One is that you have to pay a certain particular rent every year. So let's not try to squeeze too much out of this, and let's go on.
We don't want to squeeze too much juice from this fruit. Yes.
Exactly. Rav Yosef Shar Lahu Livnei Beit Tarbu L'Me'avar B'Maya L'Meisei L'Firka. So Rav Yosef let people from Beit Tarbu, which is a particular village, Rashi says Shem Akvar, to go to a shiur, to go through water to go to a shiur. When was the shiur?
Presumably on Yom Kippur.
On Yom Kippur, again, it's another thing. So here this goes back to what? It goes back to the Braita that began this part of the sugya, that one is allowed to go to give kavod to one's Rav, or even to go to somebody who is greater than you in Chokhmah. That in and of itself is enough. Even if you're not going to learn Torah, you would be allowed to go through water. But now we're introducing another idea. You're allowed to go through water specifically to learn Torah, Seder. So that would fall. In other words, the basic idea of going to a shir, going through water on Yom Kippur to hear a shir, I would certainly be able to derive that from the Braita, even though the Braita doesn't specifically talk about going to learn, it just talks about going to greet. But there I would say it's a kol shekain. If you're allowed to go to greet your Rebbe or even somebody who's more learned than you, certainly you would be allowed to go to learn Torah, Seder. So, but what's the chidush here? That he allowed them to go, l'meizal lo sharahu. He didn't allow them to leave. They were allowed to go, they weren't allowed to leave. Why weren't they allowed to leave?
Because that would not be for the sake of Talmud Torah.
All right, yeah. So they're not allowed to leave because there is no compelling interest. They're not going to give kavod, they're not going for Talmud Torah. And so there is no reason to give them a heter to get wet again on Yom Kippur. Amar le Abaye, so Abaye says, Im ken atamachshilan latid lavo. If that's so, you will cause them to stumble in the future. So if what is so?
If they were not permitted to go to return to return from the shiur on Yom Kippurim, then
Then what?
Yeah. Then presumably if they weren't allowed to return, they presumably wouldn't go in the first place.
Right, you'll be machshilan latid lavo, you'll cause them to stumble in the future, meaning, as you say, that they won't go all together. And the implication is we want them to go. So it's not just they would be permitted to go to the shiur, but Abai is saying here we have, there's a compelling interest because we would want them to go on, even on Yom Kippur, that we'd want them to go to learn Torah. Right, so just to give a little context, we brought this up last time and my head was a little foggy. So Rabbah and Rav Yosef were the Gedolim at that time in Bavel, and among their students were Abaye and Rava. And Gemara says elsewhere at the beginning of Yoma, that halacha is like Rava when there is a dispute with Abaye in all but 6 cases. And Abaye and Rava, if you've learned any amount of Gemara, come up, I don't know, hundreds of times. I start to listen to a shiur that's online from Rav David Weiss Halivni, and he was talking about about Abaye specifically. And so he said, I think, the exact number of times that Abaye appears in the Bavli, but I don't have the bikiyas or the mind of Rav Livni Zichrono Livracha. So I can just tell you that Abaye and Rav appear a lot of times. The reason I mention is because Abaye vis-a-vis Rav Yosef would be a student. Abaye is a student of Rav Yosef. So when Abaye says to Rav Yosef, he says, if that's so, right? If you don't let them go back on Yom Kippur after you let them go to learn on Yom Kippur, then you'll cause a stumbling block for them in the future that they won't go to learn. So he's pointing out what he feels to be a halachic flaw to his Rebbe. So stop. So that we'll have the Ika Amri in a moment. But so at that moment, if that would be the whole sugya, what would we say the halacha is?
And that they could go but not come back at that point.
Okay, why would you say that would be the halacha?
That's what it says, that he permitted them to go, but he didn't let them come back.
But then I have, but I'm saying, but then I have Abaye's comment. So what are you saying? That Abaye's comment wouldn't change that halacha?
He's just questioning it, or it's his comment is that he doesn't accept it.
Well, what you say first is maybe is more true. He's questioning it, but so here when you so here's the thing. When you're learning it, so now you have a question. Does Abaye's what's the halachic status, or what's the halachic import of Abaye's comment? So Abaye is a Talmid of Rav Yosef. So on the one hand, we might say Abaye can't really disagree with Rav Yosef as such, but here, what do we have? I have a psak from Rav Yosef, and I have a counter that to that psak from Abaye, right? Which he puts in the form of a challenge. So if that would be the end of the sugya, if I had no other information, now I'd have to decide. The fact that Abaye is Talmid of Rav Yosef, maybe that means that I ignore what Abaye says. On the other hand, because of the way Gemara is presented, since he has the last word, I might assume that the Stam Gemara, right, the editor of the Gemara is trying to leave off with Abaye's point, in which case the Stam Gemara is trying to say that halacha would really be about like Abaye. These are just, I'm pointing this out because, when we learn Gemara, as we know, and we've talked about many times, we have issues in Gemara that come up where the Gemara doesn't tell us what the psak is. And that's, this is why we look at Rishonim to understand, and to understand how to paskin. So we have to be conscious of these things. So at this moment, maybe it's not 100% clear, but what I would say is that the Gemara is leaning toward the idea that one would be permitted to go through water to hear a shir, and if you did that one, like Abaye, would be permitted to go back on Yom Kippur, because that's where that part of the sugya ends. Then I have the Ika Amre, right? So I have those who say, those who have a different version of this story. Shara lahu l'meite, v'shara lahu l'meizal. He let them go and he let them leave. Amarle Abaye said to him, Bishlam l'meite l'chai. So it's okay that he let them go, cheers. I was thinking, what's a good translation? Cheers, like let him go. Right? That's what the British would say. Cheers, mate. Ela lemezal, my time. But to let him leave, what's the reason? So what would be the reason to allow him to go back? In order not to be machshilan latidava. So we did this last week, but let's do it again. Shara lahu l'meite, he let them go and he let them leave. So who's the he who let them go?
Rav Yosef let them go. Let B'nai Beit Tarbo.
Yeah, he let them go. He let the B'nai, very good. He let the B'nai Beit Tarbo go on Yom Kippur to go through water to hear a shir, and he also told them they're allowed to come back from the shir to go through water again. So Abaye now says to Rav Yosef, his Rebbe, he says to let them go. Chai, that's fine. Like that makes sense. my time, right? To let them leave, what would be the reason? And so then presumably Rav Yosef replies, and he says, in order not to let them be a stumbling block for in the future. So now what would I say the halacha is?
Now it seems clear that you can go and come back.
Why is it clear now?
We
Oh,
have a maaseh that was rabbanim.
Well, they're both rabbanim.
Oh, never mind. Actually, I mean, Abaye trumps Rabbah.
Michael Schwartz, what did you want to say?
No, now I'm confused because it's the same situation where you have Abaye questioning Rav Yosef or commenting on it. But here it's not, it's stated, it seems to be stated more definitively that here's the reason why you would let him come back. As before, you just say if you don't let him come back, you're creating a problem. Here it's saying you do let him come back.
So in the first instance, Rav Yosef said they could go, but they couldn't come back. And Abaye, his student, questioned him. In the second instance, Rav Yosef, the Rav, says they can go and come back. And Abaye, his student, questions him, and Rav Yosef upholds his psak, and he says there's a reason why I let them come back. So in terms of we had a question in the first iteration, since it leaves off with Abaye's challenge, we were trying to figure out the fact that Abaye is the student of Rav Yosef, on the one hand, might indicate to me that maybe halacha is like Rav Yosef and not his student, or on the other hand, maybe halacha is still like the student because of the way the Gemara presented it. So the Gemara presented Abaye's challenge at the end, and he doesn't get, there's no continuation where Rav Yosef shoots that down. But here in the second iteration, Rav Yosef is the one who gives the psak that they can go and come back. So the fact that Abaye challenges him doesn't take away from the psak at all, because Rav Yosef answers the challenge. He says, "Kadesh l'achshilon latid lavo." So here it's a more definitive iteration for me to say that definitely the halacha would be that they would be allowed to go and come back. So now let's again keep in mind what was the Gemara that came just before this. It was the psak of the Neturei Pirei. It was the psak that you're allowed to go and check on, to guard your fruit on Yom Kippur. Now I have the heter of going through water on Yom Kippur in order to hear a shir. So the heter extends to both going and returning. So now if I were to ask you, on Yom Kippur, if you go to check on your fruit, to guard your fruit on Yom Kippur, you go through water, are you allowed to go and come back? Or are you just allowed to go and you would have to wait till after Yom Kippur to come back?
You presumably could come back.
Why?
That's what I understand.
Why would you say that? What was the heter for what was the heter for coming back from the shiur?
But the next time you wouldn't be nichshal.
Right, you wouldn't come back. So now does that reasoning apply to Shomrei Perot?
No.
Why do you say no?
Because it would seem to be that the other activity the activity of going back only applies if one has crossed a river for learning from one's teacher for the sake of Talmud Torah, or one of the other cases that we have addressed so far, such as giving kavod to one's.
Oh, okay, wait. Now you're raising a good point. So I'm asking, for the moment, I'm asking about Shomrei Peirot. And you're saying, okay, so we have on the one hand going to hear a shiur, and I have on the other hand Shomrei Peirot.
Okay, never mind. I misheard your question. Yeah.
No, but it's okay. So then now you want to say maybe going to hear a shiur, that I could include in that category going mishum kavod. Maybe going mishum kavod is in the category of to go to the pirka, to go to the shiur, in which case you would be able to go and come back. And why would I say that it would be in the same category?
I'm sorry, I just lost your last sentence.
Oh, so why would I put going mishum kavod in the same category as going for Talmud Torah?
Oh, because if you're going for Talmud Torah, you're giving kavod to one's teacher. You're giving kavod to your teacher, or kavod to the Torah itself.
Yeah, but what if you're going to mishum kavod av?
They're both mitzvot.
That's the point. The point is, those are both mitzvot. There's a mitzvah to give kavod to your father and to your teacher, even not to learn Torah. And there's also a mitzvah to go and learn Torah. There's not a mitzvah to guard your peirot. When the Torah is concerned about your financial well-being, but there isn't a special mitzvah for you to go and guard your property. So it would be reasonable for me to say that just like Rav Yosef allows people to go through water on Yom Kippur in order to guard their peirot and come back, presumably I could make the argument that he would also allow them to go to be makbil pnei aviv pnei rabo pnei gadol mimenu, and to come back, because he went for a mitzvah, and I don't want him in the future to not do the mitzvah. Right? Right? So in order not to have them miss out on that mitzvah in the future, I let them go and come back. Or I might say, no, that I'm still going to put kavod in a separate category, even though there's a mitzvah involved, but there's a greater compelling interest for me to make sure that they go and learn, because that would be, because touching on again on the Mishnah in the sugya in Peyah, Talmud Torah keneged kulam. Talmud Torah, on the scale of things, outweighs other mitzvot. So, without getting too much in the weeds there, nonetheless, the idea of being shomer peirot is clearly in a different category, because there isn't a mitzvah. So the fact that Rav Yosef allows you to go and come back for Talmud Torah doesn't necessarily tell me anything about going and coming back for Shomrei Peirot. In fact, I might say that, okay, Rav Yosef, in this, especially the way I understand the second iteration, that Rav Yosef gave this heter to go and come back because he didn't want to be machshil latid lavo, that people won't go to learn on Yom Kippur. But he didn't give the heter to come back if you're going to be Shomer Peirot. Then once you go, you can go, and then you'll have to wait till the end of the day to come back. That is, I don't have any real evidence otherwise. I don't have it. The only heter that the Gemara gave for Shomrei Perot was where it says Rav Shar Livnei Evri Yamina L'Ma'avar B'Mailin Ture Pire. And I have a Braita that supports that. Shomrei Perot Avina Tzavar B'Mailin V'Ein Chosheshim. So that's if you're going to be Shomer Perot. But what if you're not going to be Shomer Perot? That is, what if you're coming back? Then there's no heter. There's no obvious heter. Okay. Let's go on a little further. Rav Yehuda Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda Havukaime Aguda de Nahar Prat Amabra de Chatzdad. So Rav Yehuda and Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda, they were standing on the bank of the river Prat. There's a gears that says the river Papa. It's not clear if that's a mistake or not, because in a moment we'll see Bahabakai Rami bar Papa Mehach Kisa. Could just be that it was a mistake by the copyist or whatever. We're gonna read it with Prat, which is the tikkun of the Masorah Tashas here. So these two Rabbanim, Rav Yehuda, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda, they're standing on one side of the Euphrates River at the Mabra de Chatzdad. Rashi explains the Mabra de Chatzdad, Makom Ma'avar HaNahar Mu Chatzdad. Right, this is the place that you would cross through the river. This would be a place where you would ford the river. You would go through, right? Because we're clearly still talking about this question of going through water, and we're not talking about any kind of either a bridge or a land connection or a ferry. It's just saying that this is where you would cross the river, right? So like when you're going down a river, to get to the other side where there is no bridge, there are going to be certain places in the river that are easier to cross through. Those will be the places where people will normally go from one side to the other.
Shel,
yes.
It doesn't make sense that it could be the Nahar Prat, because the Nahar Prat is a real river. But all this, the word Nahar, we now know that these are irrigation canals. And because the place where the Jews were living, there were a huge number of small irrigation canals and of course, those you can cross them, but you can't cross this huge river where they were living. There was a river. Besides, they write it, what does it mean? You mean a smaller, you have to look at the Nahar Prat goes from the north to the south.
Well, but it's not first of all, it's not a straight line, and second of all, let's leave that aside for the moment. But the second point that you make, I think, in a way, you've answered your own question. What does it mean, Amabra de Chatzdad? So Chatzdad was the name of a place. So the whole breadth of, I'm not an expert in geography, but I think the whole breadth of Nahar Prat per se maybe isn't even possible to go through, to walk through. I don't know, but there's some kind of a passageway at Chatzdad. So does it get you all the way to the other side of Nahar Prat, or does it just get you to the other side of, like what you're saying, like a tributary of Nahar Prat? That to say it doesn't make sense, it just means that we're kind of lacking the geography, because people really live there, or else Nahar Papa is the real Girsa, and Nahar Papa was a smaller river. But the point is, without trying to say too much here, because I don't know enough of the geography in it, and I actually did try to check out Chatzdad and I didn't do a deep dive, but I didn't find anybody who identified it as a particular place. It was just a name of a place at the time.
It's לחצות מצד לצד.
That's what you want to say. Amabra de Chatzdad. That's interesting. You're darshaning it. Drasha. That could be. You know what? You may be right, but then it's a little. Look at that. It's interesting. Rashi says Makom Ma'avar Hanarmu Chatzdad. It was opposite Chatzdad. It was a place called Chatzdad, and the other sources that I looked at agreed with Rashi that was the name of a place. However, if I wanted to say a little bit more based on what you're saying, maybe it was called Chatzdad because it was the Makom Ma'avar, and that makes sense. That's interesting. Anyway, what's the problem? So we have these two Rabbanim, Rav Yehuda, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda. They're standing on one side of this ma'avar. V'havakai Rami bar Papa mihach pisa. So Rami bar Papa was on the other side. He was on this side, right? Hach pisa. Rama luhu kala. So he raised his voice to them. Rami bar Papa raises his voice. In other words, he calls out to Rav Yehuda and Rav Shmuel. Calls out, Mahu leme'avar leme'esei legabaychu lemishal shmaita. What is the din to pass over, to go toward you, to ask about a point of learning? So what is he asking? What's his question?
Can you cross the river to ask a Torah question from them?
Okay, so am I allowed to cross the river today on Yom Kippur to ask you a shaila, to ask you a question about a point of learning? So based on what we learned so far, what should their answer be?
Yes, if it's not above his head, yes.
So it must be right. So that's what we're going to assume. So Amar le Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yehuda says, he answers Rami bar Papa. He says, Rav and Shmuel, the Amri Tarvaya, they both said, over, you're allowed to pass over, right? So Rav Yehuda was a Talmud of both Rav and Shmuel. And he says, yes, you're allowed to pass through the water to come and ask the Shaila. One is allowed to pass through water to go ask a Shaila or to go to learn on Yom Kippur, as long as you don't take your hand out from underneath the bottom of the hem of your clothing. So what does that mean? What does that mean? That you can't take your hand out from under the hem of the clothing? What I want to do, because it's getting late, let's look at Rashi here. In other words, so now I understand, I'm bringing this ma'aseh because now it's introducing another detail to this idea of passing through water in Yom Kippur. That there is going to be another limitation. You're allowed to go through, but you're not allowed to take your hand out from under the bottom of your clothing. So why not? And what does that mean? Like, what exactly is going on here? So let's start to address this, and then we're going to address it more fully next time. So Rashi says, Mitachat chefet sfat chaluko. The chefet is the hem of his garment. L'hagbia shulei chaluko al zro'o. To lift up the hem of his garment on his arm. Deino kemalbush. it's not like a piece of clothing. Ella kenosei ktefav. Rather, it's more like he's carrying it on his shoulder. The Amar Mar, and Mar said in the Gemara in Shabbat, Hayotze betalit mekupelet al ketefo b'Shabbat chayav chatat. If somebody goes out with their garments folded onto their shoulder on Shabbat, they're chayav chatat. So how does Rashi understand this idea? How does he envision the garment? What kind of garment is he wearing? And what does it mean to take your hand out from under the hem of your garment?
It's almost like he's, to a certain extent, undressing and carrying his cloak rather than wearing it through the river.
So how do you envision the garment that he's wearing?
Just some kind of robe.
It seems like, okay, yeah, some kind of a robe. So, what's he going to do? Your natural inclination, if you're wearing a robe, if that's your garment, when you're going into water, you're going to want to lift up the hem so it doesn't get wet. Now, we're talking about people who can go even up to their neck, but, maybe it's not up to their neck. Maybe it's just up to their ankles. Maybe it's just up to their knees, right? So they don't want to get the garment wet. And we already mentioned reasons, even halachic reasons, why they wouldn't want to get it wet, right? Because they don't want to make it look like they're washing their clothes on Yom Kippur, and they don't want to worry about possibly squeezing it out. So maybe, they have good reason to try to avoid that. So they're like lifting up the bottom, like their hem. And so Rashi says, what does it mean? Shelo yotzi yado mitachat chayfet chaluko. That somehow, right? So if you take the wording here is still a little bit difficult to understand, but the idea would be somehow that when you take your arm out from underneath the chaluk, or you could reach down inside of your chaluk and lift up the hem. Right, so maybe it's like a very loose garment, and you're taking your arm, you take your arm out and lift up the hem. And so what's the fear? And then you'd be lifting up and like draping it on your arm. And then it's like, so even though you're wearing the garment, but once you take part of it and drape it over your arm or put it over your shoulder, then you're carrying that part of the garment. It looks as if like you're carrying. And that's what the Gemara says elsewhere. If you take your talits, and talits is not dafka, a talita what we have it now, but it was some kind of a garment that people would wear. And you fold it up so that you're not wearing part of it, but you're just carrying part of it, even though you're wearing the other part of it. That's carrying also on Shabbat, and that's not permitted. So,
you think it's a problem of tiltul?
It's a problem of hotza'ah, of lavir arba amot b'reshut rabim. So even though the river is not necessarily reshut rabim, but at least it's a karmelit, it would still be forbidden for you to carry on through the water on Shabbat. So next time, we'll do this a little bit more next time. I just want to read a little bit more, and then we're going to stop. Rav Shmuel Damar Tarvayo, so Rami Bar Papa asks this question: am I allowed to go through the water to come over and ask you a question? So Rav Yehuda says that Rav and Shmuel both agree you're allowed to go, but as long as, now I'll just paraphrase based on Rashi, as long as you don't carry part of your clothing when you're going through. Amarle Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda. So the other Rav who was there, right, was Rav Yehuda and Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda. So Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda supports Rav Yehuda. He says, Tanina, says, we learned that in a Braita. Over uvilvad shelo yotzi yado mitachat chayfet chalukah. So I learned a Braita that's just like what you learned from Rav and Shmuel. So Rav and Shmuel had this Masorah, and he says, I can support that Masorah with a Braita. So whatever you see, that whenever you can, you try to support your statements with an earlier source, like from a Tanaitic source.
Is it not a problem of tzniut?
Well, I think that's going to be a question, although once you go in the water, you're going to be covered up. In other words, I guess you would ask the question like this. Again, it gets into questions of realia, like Mahaya HaMetziut Be'emet. So maybe his only garment is a robe. He doesn't have underwear the way we have underwear. So if he lifts the garment, and maybe he has to go, let's say, up to his waist or up to his chest. So when he lifts up the garment, isn't he going to be exposed? So, but you could imagine that he goes in such a way that he lifts it up as he's going in, so that by the time he gets to his waist, at the same time that he's going into water, he's lifting up the garment. Yesh lomar. It's a side question. It's an interesting question. So this is where I want to stop for today. And if you I told you last time you could read Yechezkel Mem Zayin, because those are the psukim that Rav Yosef is going to quote. And Im Kvar, I should also mention to read these other psukim. There's another pasuk that's quoted here from Yeshaya Perek Lamed Gimel pasuk Kaf Aleph. So you can find it there on the daf. It'll have the reference. Rav Yosef is going to challenge this question of how deep you can go bichlal into water, even when it's not Yom Kippur. And that's going to be the subject for next time. But this is a good place to stop. I think we'll leave it here. So, very good. Any last questions, comments? Okay. So, Kol Tuv. See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.